The Bedford Meetinghouse has been a landmark of the center of Bedford since its construction 200 years ago. By the early 1700s, the land that we call Bedford was already occupied by Europeans who had moved west from the original settlements in Plymouth and Boston. In those days, the settlers were required by law to attend church every Sunday, which meant walking to either Concord Center or to Billerica Center, each a distance of about 5 miles. In the winter, this meant trekking for hours through heavy snow. By 1726, the people had had enough. Several settlers got together and petitioned for relief to the towns of Concord and Billerica to allow them to separate into their own town with their own meeting house. The petition read in part, quote, "In the extreme difficult seasons of heat and cold, we were ready to say of the Sabbath, 'Behold, what a weariness it is.'" To this petition, Concord was agreeable, but Billerica was opposed. So the petitioners appealed to the Great and General Court, the legislative body of the colony of Massachusetts. In spite of Billerica's opposition, the Great and General Court passed an Act of Incorporation for the town of Bedford on September 23, 1729. The act required that, quote, "said town of Bedford do, within a space of 3 years from the publication of this act, erect, build, and finish a suitable house for the public worship of God, and procure and settle a learned Orthodox minister of good conversation, and make provision for his comfortable and honorable support." The citizens of Bedford quickly settled on the site for their meeting house, a parcel of gentle upland, 9 acres in size, which abutted the Concord to Woburn Road, roughly the same path as the present State Route 62. The land surrounding the meeting house would be, as it is today, the Bedford Town Common. So fast was that first meeting house constructed that it held its first public meeting in the fall of that same year, 1729. The building was 2 stories with a V roof and doors on the south, east, and west sides. The side nearest the road had no door, for that was the pulpit from which the minister preached. That first meeting house served the town well for almost a century. But the town was growing and the meeting house was becoming crowded. On April 1st, 1815, 14 citizens sponsored Article 6 on the annual town meeting warrant, quote, "to know if it be the mind of the town to build a new meeting house and to make arrangements for the purpose." A committee was appointed to study the matter. But then, on September 22nd, 1815, a great gale blew into New England, flattening many buildings and causing widespread damage. The gale, which was probably a hurricane, was felt as far south as Delaware. In Bedford, some buildings were damaged and many trees were felled. The study committee immediately increased the size of the new meeting house, given that the town had what might be called a windfall of free building material just lying around. A plan by a noted architect of the time, Mr. Asher Benjamin, was adopted. That same plan was used by several other New England meeting houses of the period, including the Charles Street Church in Boston. Townsmen gathered on July 8, 1816, to demolish the first meeting house. Many of the building's materials were reused in the new meeting house, including several large structural timbers which have been carefully preserved and which can be viewed today. The new meeting house was built over the next year at a total cost of $6,101. The money was raised in part by selling the rights to pews on the main floor. Those who could not afford to purchase a pew were forced to sit in the balcony which surrounds the sanctuary. The building was completed and dedicated on July 8, 1817. The original building was exactly what you see today, except the clock at the base of the bell tower was not yet in place. Over the next 200 years, the Bedford Meetinghouse has undergone many changes, both inside and out. At the dedication in 1817, Mr. Jeremiah Fitch, who had also purchased a bell for the church, presented as a gift a new Willard clock surmounted by a gold eagle to hang in the rear of the sanctuary. The original settlers of the town were Puritans who frowned upon the presence of musical instruments in church. But by the turn of the 19th century, this restriction had been somewhat relaxed, and by 1840, the Bedford Church had acquired a 3-string double bass viol made by a self-taught craftsman named Abraham Prescott to accompany the hymn singing. The instrument had 3 strings instead of the usual 4 strings, presumably because then it was not suitable for secular purposes and could only be used for godly purposes. In 1848, the sanctuary underwent a major renovation. The box pews like this one were removed and replaced with the present-day pews. The sanctuary was as yet unheated, so many parishioners used portable coal or wood heaters to keep their feet warm. One such unit is shown on the floor in this picture. Other parishioners brought their dogs to church and used them as foot warmers. During the renovation, a furnace was added in the basement and grates were cut into the floor to conduct the heat up into the sanctuary. The 2-story sanctuary was reduced to a single story to conserve heat by the addition of a low arched ceiling, which made the room easier to heat, but at the cost of isolating the original balcony. Sometime during the Civil War, to celebrate good news from the front, it is reported that 2 boys, in an excess of patriotism, rang the church bell with such enthusiasm that it cracked and thereafter could not be used. The church would be without a bell until 1926. In 1890, a Hook and Hastings pipe organ was donated to the church. The organ still has its original mechanical track-action keyboard. Pressing a key pulls a lever that opens a valve, allowing compressed air to enter one of the pipes. In 1893, the arched ceiling was removed and the balcony spaces were closed in with new amber glass windows. In 1907, a steeple clock was donated by Mr. Dudley L. Pickman to complete the front of the meeting house. The original clock mechanism still works and must still be wound every week by hand. The very next year, the building was wired for electricity. In 1926, Mrs. Clara Blinn donated the present-day church bell in memory of her husband, George. The clock mechanism and the bell were connected together so the clock could strike the hour as it does today. In 1961, a small addition was added to the rear of the meeting house to house religious education classes, church offices, and a large fellowship hall. It was the first change in the building's footprint in 144 years. By the end of the 20th century, the congregation had once again outgrown the meeting house. The parish decided to replace the small 1961 addition with a new, larger addition to provide adequate office space, religious education classrooms, and meeting spaces to meet the needs of a growing congregation as the Bedford Meetinghouse moves into its third century of service.